On a freezing winter night, under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, a man named Jake Turner made a choice that would change everything. Hunched under a tattered coat, Jake, a man who had lost everything to a past he couldn't escape, came across a young mother, Natalie, cradling her infant son, Liam, on a frost-covered park bench. With nothing left to give but the coat on his back, Jake handed it over, unknowingly sparking a connection that would shape both their lives forever. But what happens when a single act of kindness starts to unravel a life carefully hidden in shadows? For years, Jake has lived on the margins, haunted by regrets and a reputation destroyed. Natalie, on the other hand, is running from her own demons, desperate to protect her child. Both of them are fighting to survive, but neither knows that their paths are about to intertwine in ways they can't yet imagine. Together, they will face challenges that push them to their limits, an eviction that threatens the only safe haven they've found, unexpected violence that tests their resolve, and a painful confrontation with the ghosts of Jake's past. Yet, through it all, they will discover that even the smallest sparks of kindness can ignite something powerful: hope, redemption, and the courage to begin again. The night had fallen hard on the city, pulling a heavy blanket of freezing wind over everything it touched. The streets were empty, save for a few flickering streetlights that seemed to shiver in the bitter cold. Ice clung to the sidewalks like a silent warning, and the only sounds were the sharp whines of the wind and the occasional scrape of footsteps against the pavement. Jake Turner trudged through the darkness, his shoulders hunched and his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his old, tattered coat. It was threadbare in places, barely holding back the icy wind that cut through him like glass. The cold seeped into his bones, making him shiver uncontrollably, but he had grown used to it. When you lived on the streets, you learned to endure. Jake's face was thin and angular, his beard patchy and rough. His eyes, once full of ambition and warmth, now seemed to hold only exhaustion. Once, long ago, Jake had been a doctor, in fact, with a promising career ahead of him. Now, that felt like a lifetime ago, like a story he had read about someone else. Life had broken him piece by piece until he no longer recognized the man he saw in broken reflections on the windows he passed. Tonight, like most nights, Jake was looking for a place to hide from the cold. He knew of an underpass near the river where the wind would not bite as fiercely. But as he passed through the park on his way, something caught his eye. There, beneath the dim glow of a distant street lamp, was a figure on a frost-covered bench. At first, Jake thought it was his imagination. No one stayed out in weather like this unless they had no other choice. But then, he heard a sound so faint it barely reached his ears. A baby crying. Jake stopped walking. He stared into the shadows, his mind trying to convince him to keep moving. Years on the streets had taught him not to get involved. Looking meant caring, and caring led to trouble. But the sound was persistent, soft, yet full of pain, and before he knew it, his feet were moving toward the bench. As he got closer, the scene became clearer. A young woman sat hunched over, clutching a small bundle to her chest. Her face was pale and gaunt, her lips a dull shade of purple. Her thin coat looked more like a sheet than something meant for warmth. The baby, wrapped in threadbare blankets, whimpered weakly against the cold. The woman's hands trembled as she tried to adjust the fabric to cover the child's face, but it was clear she was losing the fight. Jake stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching her. He could have turned around. He could have left her there and gone on his way. But something about her, maybe it was the way she held the baby so protectively, despite her obvious suffering, hid a part of him that he thought had died long ago. The woman noticed him then, her eyes widening with a mix of fear and faint hope. She pulled the baby closer, her body curling around him as though she could shield him from everything. Jake swallowed hard, his voice rough and unused. "You are going to freeze out here." The woman flinched, as if bracing for some kind of harm. But when Jake took a step closer, he moved slowly, carefully, as though trying not to scare an injured animal. "I am not going to hurt you. I just—" He glanced down at her shivering form and realized he had nothing to offer but his coat. His coat. Jake hesitated. He thought about the icy wind that had already been cruel to him tonight. Without the coat, he would be defenseless against the cold. But then he looked at the baby again, his small face peeking out from the folds of the thin blankets. The child's skin was almost as pale as the snow around them. Without saying another word, Jake began unbuttoning his coat. The cold air hit his chest like a punch, but he ignored it. The woman's eyes widened in shock as Jake stepped closer, holding the coat out toward her. "No," she murmured weakly, shaking her head. "You need it too." Jake's voice was firm, but quiet. "You need it more." Before she could protest further, he gently draped the coat over her shoulders. It was large on her, but it covered both her and the baby completely. The woman blinked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You'll be warmer now," Jake muttered, already taking a step back. The cold hit him like a wall, making him shiver violently. But he shoved his hands into the pockets of his sweater and turned to leave. "Wait," the woman said, her voice barely audible. Jake paused, not turning around. "Thank you," she whispered. Her words trembled in the cold, but they carried more warmth than anything he had felt in years. Jake gave a small nod, though he did not look at her again. "Take care of the baby," he said, his voice rough with something he could not quite name. Then he walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the park. The wind was crueler now, biting at him with renewed strength. Without the coat, the cold wrapped around Jake like a predator, sinking its claws deep into his skin. He shivered uncontrollably, his teeth chattering as he made his way toward the underpass. The shelter beneath the bridge was crowded with others who had nowhere else to go. Bodies huddled together for warmth, wrapped in blankets and tattered clothes. Jake found a corner for himself and sank down onto the cold concrete. He pulled his knees up to his chest and buried his face in his arms, trying to ignore the violent shivers that ran through him. Around him, the soft murmur of people settling in for the night filled the air. It was heavy with despair and silence, the kind of silence that pressed down on you like a weight. But Jake could not stop thinking about the woman and her baby. He wondered what had led them to that park bench. He wondered if they would be all right through the night. The memory of her face, so pale and fragile, would not leave him. Neither would the baby's soft whimpers. For years, Jake had lived in his own bubble of survival. The streets taught you not to care, not to look, not to get involved. It was easier that way, but something had shifted inside him tonight. The simple act of giving his coat to someone else, a coat he desperately needed, had stirred a part of him that had been buried for too long. As the cold gnawed at him, Jake closed his eyes and let out a slow breath. Maybe what he had done was foolish. Maybe it would cost him more than he could afford. But for some reason, he did not regret it. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had done something that mattered. Far away, in the temporary shelter of Jake's coat, Natalie Brooks held Liam close to her chest. The coat was worn and old, but it was warm. And for the first time in days, Liam's cries quieted. Natalie looked down at her son, her eyes filling with tears. She thought of the man who had given up his own warmth for a stranger. She had not even asked his name, but she would not forget his face, the face of a man who had nothing, and still gave everything. "I'll find you," Natalie whispered to herself, pressing a kiss to Liam's forehead. "I promise, I will find you." The night wore on, the city silent except for the wind. But in the quiet, a spark had been lit. A spark of kindness that would grow into something much bigger than either Jake or Natalie could imagine. The morning came slowly, its light faint and cold as it crept across the city streets. The winter air was sharp, and the snow that had fallen overnight clung to everything like a thin sheet of glass. Inside the shelter, the air was warmer, the sounds softer, a hum of quiet voices, the shuffle of footsteps, and the faint rustle of blankets being pulled tighter. Natalie Brooks woke with a start. Her arms instinctively tightened around her baby, Liam, who was still bundled up inside the old coat. The coat, his coat. She stared at it for a moment, her fingers brushing the worn fabric. The man from the park lingered in her mind, his thin frame, the quiet strength in his eyes, and the way he had disappeared into the night without waiting for thanks. Her heart ached as she remembered how he had shivered after giving it to her. She didn't know his name, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he had sacrificed more than he let on. A voice broke her thoughts. "How's the little one?" Natalie looked up to see Sophia Green, the shelter's director, crouching down beside her cot. Sophia's voice, steady and warm, always made the shelter feel safer than it should have. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, though wisps had escaped around her face, and her expression carried the weight of someone who had seen too much but refused to give up. "He's better," Natalie replied softly, glancing at Liam, who was still asleep. The coat had kept him warm through the night. "I don't know what would have happened if that man hadn't come." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "A man?" Natalie hesitated, as if the memory might vanish if she spoke it aloud. "Last night, in the park. He gave me his coat." She swallowed hard, the guilt pressing against her chest. "He didn't have much, but he just gave it to me. And then he left. I don't even know his name." Sophia studied her for a moment before standing. "Acts like that are rare, but they mean something. Hold on to that." She gave a small, encouraging smile before walking off to tend to the others. Natalie sat there for a moment, staring at Liam's sleeping face. The shelter was warm, yes, but temporary. She had been here for a week, and every day that passed, she felt the weight of the uncertainty pressing on her. The coat was a lifeline, but the man who had given it to her, he was out there somewhere, alone and unprotected. "I have to find him," she whispered to Liam, as if saying it aloud would make it real. "He helped us, and I need to make sure he's okay." Liam stirred slightly, his little hand peeking out of the coat sleeve. It was a small reminder of why she could not sit still. Not today. Natalie had always been someone who waited for things to get better, waited for someone to save her. But something about last night had shifted her. That man had not waited to act, and now she could not wait either. Natalie borrowed an old pair of boots and a scarf from one of the other residents at the shelter, Clara Evans, an elderly woman who had been staying there for months. "You're going out in this weather?" Clara asked, her voice soft but tinged with concern. Natalie nodded, bundling Liam carefully in his blankets before sliding him into a second-hand baby carrier strapped to her chest. "I have to. Someone help me, and I can't leave it like this." Clara studied her for a long moment before reaching out and patting her arm. "Not everyone would do what you're doing. Be careful out there, dear." "I will," Natalie promised. "Thank you." The city streets were unforgiving. The snow crunched under her borrowed boots as Natalie walked, her breath visible in the icy air. Liam was quiet, his small body pressed close to hers for warmth. The cold seemed to seep through her layers, but she ignored it, pushing forward with a determination that surprised even her. She retraced her steps, back to the park where she had met him. The bench where they had sat was still there, covered in a thin layer of frost. Natalie stood there for a moment, staring at it as memories from the night before flooded back. The man, thin, tired and quiet, had come to her when no one else did. She turned her head, searching the park for any sign of him. All she saw were empty pathways, the wind chasing dried leaves across the ground. A few people huddled on benches or under trees, their forms wrapped in blankets or layers of clothing, but none of them were him. Natalie swallowed her disappointment and moved toward one of the figures, sitting near a cluster of frozen bushes. A man in his 40s, wearing a torn cap and an oversized coat, glanced up warily as she approached. "Excuse me," Natalie said gently, stopping a few feet away. "I'm looking for someone. A man, thin, dark hair, gave me his coat last night." The man studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "Haven't seen him." His voice was gruff, and he quickly looked away, pulling his coat tighter. Natalie tried again with a few others. An older woman wrapped in a heavy quilt, a man with a cardboard sign sitting near the park entrance. But no one knew where Jake was. Most barely looked at her, their eyes hollow with their own struggles. By late afternoon, Natalie's feet were aching, and the cold had settled deep into her bones. She sat on the same bench from the night before, pulling Liam closer to her chest. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't cry, she couldn't give up. "Where are you?" she murmured, staring out into the gray sky. Liam stirred slightly, letting out a small sound, and Natalie instinctively rocked him. She looked down at the baby and let out a shaky breath. "We'll find him," she whispered. "We have to." The sun was beginning to set by the time Natalie stumbled across the underpass. She had wandered farther than she had planned, her hope keeping her moving even as her body cried out for rest. The underpass was a dark space beneath an old bridge, its walls covered in graffiti and the ground littered with scraps of cardboard and broken bottles. At first, Natalie thought the space was empty, but then she noticed the faint outline of people huddled together against the walls, hidden in the shadows. She hesitated, her heart pounding, before taking a cautious step forward. "Hello?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. Several heads turned toward her, their expressions guarded. A man with a scruffy beard narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" Natalie swallowed. "I'm looking for someone. He's thin, dark hair, maybe wearing a sweater. He gave me his coat last night in the park." The man stared at her for a moment, before jerking his thumb toward the far corner. "There. He's been coughing all day." Natalie's heart leapt. She turned and hurried toward the corner of the underpass. There, slumped against the cold concrete wall, was the man she had been searching for, Jake. He looked thinner than she remembered, his body trembling slightly as he sat with his knees pulled to his chest. "Jake?" Natalie whispered, though she did not know his name. He looked up slowly, his face pale and hollow, his eyes struggling to focus. Recognition flickered in his gaze as he saw her, but it was mixed with confusion. "You?" Natalie dropped to her knees beside him, shifting Liam so she could rest him on her lap. She pulled the coat off her shoulders and held it out to him. "Here, you need this." Jake stared at her, his brow furrowing. "I told you to keep it," he croaked. "I can't," Natalie said firmly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not when you're like this." Jake shook his head weakly. You need it for the baby." "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you," Natalie said, tears blurring her vision. "Please, just let me help you." For the first time in a long time, Jake could not find the words to argue. He let Natalie drape the coat over his shoulders, the warmth sinking into his frozen skin. He stared at her, bewildered. No one ever came back. No one ever cared. But here she was, sitting in the cold, her baby nestled in her lap, refusing to leave him behind. "You found me," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. Natalie smiled faintly. "You saved me first." And in that moment, something in Jake shifted a spark, faint but real. For the first time in years, someone had come looking for him. Someone had cared. The underpass was cold, damp, and smelled faintly of mildew. In the dim light that seeped through the cracks above, Natalie could see the weight of exhaustion on Jake's face. His cheeks were sunken, his lips cracked, and his hollow eyes darted between her and Liam. Wrapped in the coat he had given away just a night before, Jake looked like a man holding on to the last frayed threads of his strength. Natalie sat beside him, her back pressed against the same concrete wall. Liam stirred softly in her lap, letting out a small cry before settling again, his tiny hands peeking out of the thin blankets. Jake's gaze shifted to the baby, his expression unreadable. "You should not have come back," he muttered finally, his voice rough from the cold and disuse. "I had to," Natalie replied softly, glancing at him. "I could not stop thinking about you. You gave us this coat when you needed it most. I couldn't just leave you here." Jake let out a slow breath, staring ahead at the cracked concrete floor. He looked out of place here, as though his presence was borrowed, like everything else in his life. His hands trembled slightly under the coat, though whether from the cold or something else, Natalie could not tell. "This is where I am supposed to be," Jake said after a long pause, almost to himself. "You get used to it after a while?" Natalie frowned, shaking her head. "No one is supposed to live like this." For a moment, the two sat in silence, the cold air biting at them. Around them, other people shifted in their makeshift sleeping spaces, pulling blankets tighter or shifting against the hard ground. This underpass, like so many others in the city, was a place forgotten by everyone except those who had nowhere else to go. Natalie turned toward him, her voice hesitant but steady. "Come with me." Jake blinked, his head turning slightly. "What?" "To the shelter," she said, looking at him with a quiet determination. "Where I've been staying. It is warm. They have food. They can help you get back on your feet." Jake let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. He winced, clutching his side. "There is no getting back on my feet. People like me do not get second chances." Natalie flinched at the defeat in his voice. She recognized it well. It was the same feeling she had carried with her for so long. That empty ache of believing there was no escape, no way forward. "That is not true," she said softly. "It feels that way now, but it is not true." Jake turned his head away, as though he could not bear to look at her. "Why do you care?" Natalie hesitated, the answer forming slowly in her mind. "Because someone gave me a chance. When you gave me this coat, you saved my son." Her voice cracked slightly, but she continued. "You think it was just a coat, but it was more than that. It gave me hope when I thought all was lost. And now I am here, and I see you who saved us, and I can't leave you like this." Jake said nothing, but his shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of her words. The fight in him, what little there was, seemed to drain away. "Please," Natalie pressed gently. "Come with me, just for one night. One warm night." Jake sat there for what felt like forever, his hands shaking inside the coat, his eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Natalie waited, holding Liam close for warmth, her heart pounding with nerves. Finally, after a long silence, Jake let out a quiet sigh. "One night," he muttered. "That is all." Relief flooded Natalie's face. "Okay, one night." The walk back to the shelter was slow and silent. Natalie led the way, Liam tucked safely against her chest, while Jake followed a few steps behind. He walked stiffly, his steps unsteady, as though he was dragging the weight of the world with him. The shelter was a converted community center, its walls old but clean. Yellow light glowed faintly through the windows as they approached, promising warmth that felt almost foreign after the bitter cold of the streets. Jake paused just outside the door, staring at it like it was a line he was not sure he wanted to cross. "Come on," Natalie said softly, turning to look at him. "It's okay." Jake took a shaky breath before stepping inside. The warmth hit him like a wave. Inside, the shelter bustled with quiet activity. A few residents sat at tables eating bowls of soup, their faces tired but calm. Children played quietly in a corner, their laughter faint but present. Sophia Green appeared almost immediately, her sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on Natalie and Jake. She walked over, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "You found him," Sophia said, glancing at Jake. "You are freezing. Sit down. We will get you some food." Jake opened his mouth to protest, but Sophia was already gesturing for him to follow her. Her tone left no room for argument. Natalie smiled faintly, guiding Jake to one of the empty tables before taking a seat beside him. A steaming bowl of soup appeared in front of him within minutes, placed there by Clara Evans, who offered a small, kind smile. "Eat," she said gently. "It will help." Jake stared at the bowl for a moment before picking up the spoon. He ate slowly, his movements stiff, as though the simple act of eating in a warm room was something he had forgotten how to do. Natalie watched him, her own bowl untouched for the moment. After a while, Jake's voice broke the silence. "Thank you," he said, his words directed at no one in particular. Natalie smiled faintly. "You don't need to thank anyone." But Jake did not look up. He kept his eyes on the table, his fingers wrapped tightly around the warm bowl, as though afraid it might disappear. Later that night, Sophia showed Jake to an empty cot in the far corner of the shelter. The room was quiet now, the residents either asleep or resting. Jake stood awkwardly beside the cot, staring at the thin mattress and folded blanket. "It is not much," Sophia said softly, "but it is safe, and it is warm." Jake nodded faintly, his throat tight. He sat down on the edge of the cot, his hands resting on his knees. "Good night, Jake," Sophia said before leaving him alone in the room. Jake stared at the blanket for a long time before finally lying down. He pulled it up to his chin, the warmth settling over him like a weight he was not sure he deserved. His eyes drifted to the ceiling, where cracks spread like branches of a tree, and for the first time in a long while, he felt still. He thought about Natalie and her baby Liam. He thought about the park, the cold, and the coat he had given away. He thought about how she had come back for him, against all odds, and he wondered why. Jake closed his eyes. The warmth of the shelter surrounded him, and though the memories of his past threatened to break through, for tonight, he let himself rest. In the dark, for the first time in years, a flicker of hope touched him, faint and fragile, but real. Natalie lay on her cot in the next room, her eyes closed, but her mind still awake. Liam slept soundly beside her, his small breaths rising and falling in rhythm. She thought about the man sleeping just down the hall and the small victory she had won today. She whispered softly to Liam, brushing her fingers through his soft hair. "We found him, little one, and tomorrow we'll help him find his way back." As the shelter settled into silence, the wind howled faintly outside. But inside, the small spark of kindness that had begun in the cold of the park burned brighter now, carried forward by a second chance neither of them had seen coming. The early morning light crept into the shelter through worn-out curtains, casting faint golden streaks on the floor. The air was still, quiet, broken only by the occasional cough or the soft shuffle of footsteps. Jake Turner opened his eyes slowly, the unfamiliar warmth pulling him out of a restless sleep. For a moment, he forgot where he was. The mattress beneath him was thin but soft compared to the cold ground he had grown used to, and the blanket draped over him was a luxury he had not known in years. Then, it hit him, the shelter, the faces of Natalie and Liam, the coat he had given away, and the quiet plea that had brought him here. He turned his head, staring at the ceiling where cracks spread like veins in marble. Something in his chest felt heavy, as though his heart was unsure what to do with this small borrowed comfort. Jake sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes and wincing as his shoulder protested. His body ached from weeks of being exposed to the cold. He looked around the room, where other men lay huddled in blankets, their breathing steady as they slept. It felt strange to be surrounded by people after so long on his own. He stood carefully, trying not to make a sound, and made his way to the doorway. The dining area was already alive with quiet activity. Sophia Green, the shelter director, moved efficiently through the room, setting up coffee and organizing supplies. A few residents sat at the tables, eating bowls of oatmeal or speaking in hushed tones. At a corner table, Natalie sat with Liam in her lap, humming softly as she spooned food into the baby's mouth. Jake hesitated at the threshold, his instincts screaming at him to turn around. He didn't belong here, he never had. Yet something rooted him to the spot. Natalie looked up then, her eyes meeting his. She smiled faintly and gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Come sit," she said softly. For a moment, Jake considered walking away, but something in her voice, gentle but firm, like a hand reaching out, pulled him forward. He moved stiffly to the table and sat down across from her. "You look better," Natalie said, studying him closely. Jake let out a small, humorless laugh. "That's not saying much." Natalie smiled faintly and pushed a steaming mug of coffee toward him. "Here, drink this. It'll help." Jake stared at the cup for a moment before wrapping his hands around it. The heat seeped into his skin, and for a brief second, he allowed himself to feel it. "Thank you." "You don't have to keep saying that," Natalie replied, her voice soft but sure. "You helped me first." Jake looked down at the coffee, his reflection rippling on its dark surface. He did not know how to respond to that. The rest of the morning passed slowly. Jake kept to himself, lingering in the background while the residents of the shelter went about their routines. He noticed the way Sophia moved through the rooms with purpose, always calm, always offering a kind word. He watched Natalie as she worked alongside Clara Evans, organizing supplies and sorting through donations. Despite the challenges of the shelter, broken tables, mismatched dishes, creaking floors, there was something about it that unsettled him. It was not the chaos or the noise, it was the kindness, the way people looked out for each other, the quiet understanding in their eyes. It felt foreign to him, like stepping into a world he no longer belonged to. Jake had spent so long hiding from humanity that seeing it here, in its purest form, left him unsure of himself. "Turner." The voice startled him, and Jake turned to see Sophia standing nearby, holding a clipboard in one hand. Her sharp gaze softened slightly as she studied him. "Feeling better?" she asked. "I'm fine," Jake muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. Sophia nodded. "Good. Can I put you to work?" Jake blinked. "What?" Sophia tilted her head toward the kitchen. "Everyone here contributes however they can. Some clean, some organize, some cook. What about you?" Jake opened his mouth to protest, but Sophia gave him a look that silenced him. "You are staying here for now. The least you can do is help." Jake hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to retreat. But before he could argue, the faint sound of a baby's cry broke through the room. Natalie rushed in from the hallway, Liam pressed against her chest. "Sophia, something is wrong." Jake turned to look at them, his brow furrowing. Natalie's face was pale with worry, her arms wrapped tightly around Liam, who was crying harder now. His small face flushed, his breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. "What happened?" Sophia asked, moving toward her. "I don't know," Natalie said, her voice cracking. "He's burning up. I think he has a fever." The words hit Jake like a jolt of lightning. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Let me see him." Natalie looked at him in surprise. "What?" "Let me see him," Jake repeated firmly, holding out his hands. Natalie hesitated for only a second before carefully passing Liam to him. Jake cradled the baby in his arms, his movements instinctive and precise movements that had once been second nature to him. He placed his hand against Liam's forehead and frowned. "He's burning up." "I know," Natalie said, panic rising in her voice. Jake looked around quickly. "We need to cool him down. Do you have clean cloths and warm water?" Sophia nodded. "I'll get them." She disappeared into the kitchen while Jake sat down, still holding Liam close. He checked the baby's breathing, his pulse, years of experience flooding back to him like a river breaking its dam. "You're good at this," Natalie said quietly, kneeling beside him. Jake's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. Sophia returned with a basin of warm water and clean cloths. Jake soaked one of the cloths and wrung it out before carefully pressing it to Liam's forehead. "This will bring his temperature down." He turned to Natalie. "Talk to him. Keep him calm." Natalie nodded, her voice soft and soothing as she whispered to Liam. The baby's cries slowly began to quiet, though his breathing was still uneven. Jake worked silently, his hands steady as he replaced the cloths and checked Liam's temperature again and again. The room around him faded away. There was no shelter, no noise, no cold. There was only the baby in his arms and the knowledge that he had to help him. Hours passed like minutes. Slowly, Liam's temperature began to drop and his breathing steadied. Jake let out a quiet breath, relief washing over him. Natalie placed a hand on his arm, her voice trembling with gratitude. "You saved him." Jake shook his head, his gaze fixed on Liam. "He'll be okay now. Just keep him warm and make sure he gets rest." Sophia watched him carefully, her expression thoughtful. "You were a doctor, weren't you?" Jake froze. He looked up at her, his eyes shadowed. "A long time ago." Sophia nodded slowly, as if fitting the pieces of a puzzle together. "We could use someone like you here." Jake stood up quickly, gently handing Liam back to Natalie. "I'm not a doctor anymore," he muttered, turning away. Natalie stared after him, her heart heavy. "But you still saved him." Jake didn't respond. He walked toward the door, his steps quick, as though he was trying to escape something unseen. Sophia glanced at Natalie and said quietly, "There's more to him than he wants to admit." Natalie nodded, holding Liam close. "I know." That night, Jake sat on the edge of his cot, staring down at his hands. They still shook faintly from exhaustion, but it wasn't the cold that haunted him. It was the memory of Liam in his arms, the instinctive way his mind had slipped back into the role he had long abandoned. His hands had once saved lives, and then they had taken everything from him. He pressed his palms against his knees, his throat tight. He had told himself for years that his past was dead, that it no longer mattered. But today, for the first time, he had felt it again, that spark of purpose, the one thing he thought he had lost forever. And it terrified him. Jake Turner woke before dawn, though he hadn't really slept. The faint glow of morning crept into the shelter, spilling pale light across the room. Around him, other men stirred in their cots, but the quiet murmurs and distant sounds of life barely registered. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring down at his hands. They were still now, the tremors from the night before, gone, but he could feel the weight of yesterday in his fingertips, the steady rhythm of saving a life, the instinct that had taken over when Liam's fever had burned so hot. "Doctor," Sophia had said. The word clung to him, gnawed at him, like a splinter he couldn't remove. For years, Jake had buried the man he used to be, the young surgeon with steady hands and a reputation that seemed destined for greatness. He had built walls to keep that life out of reach, walls that protected him from the shame, the guilt, and the memory of losing everything. But those walls were cracking now, the light from yesterday shining through, and it unsettled him. By the time the shelter began to wake, Jake had already made himself useful. He stood in the dining area with sleeves rolled up, wiping down tables with an old cloth. The room buzzed with soft conversations as people began their day, Sophia directing volunteers, Clara helping the children with breakfast, and Natalie moving through the room with Liam cradled against her chest. When Natalie spotted Jake at work, she approached him slowly, her voice light but sincere. "You're up early." Jake didn't look at her as he scrubbed a particularly stubborn spot on the table. "Couldn't sleep," Natalie paused, adjusting Liam in her arms. "Well, you're helping. Sophia will appreciate that." Just trying to earn my keep, Jake muttered. Natalie smiled faintly. You already have. Jake stilled for a moment, the words catching him off guard. He glanced at her, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was no pity in her gaze, no judgment, just the same quiet understanding she had shown him since that night in the park. Jake's throat tightened, and he looked away quickly, returning to his task. Natalie watched him for another moment before speaking again. You know, she said softly, what you did for Liam yesterday, it wasn't just kindness. It saved him. You saved him. I did what anyone would have done, Jake replied, his voice clipped as he straightened and moved to another table. No, Natalie said firmly, making him stop. Not anyone. It was you. Jake turned to face her then, his expression guarded. Why does it matter so much to you? Natalie took a deep breath. Because people like me and Liam, we survive because of people like you. You don't see it, but you matter, Jake. You mattered when you gave me your coat, and you mattered when you helped my son. Jake looked away, uncomfortable under the weight of her words. I'm not who you think I am, he muttered. Maybe not, Natalie replied softly, but you're more than who you think you are. Before Jake could respond, Sophia's voice broke through the quiet. Jake. He turned to see her standing by the kitchen door, a clipboard in hand. Can you give me a hand for a minute? Relieved for the distraction, Jake nodded and followed Sophia into the kitchen. The kitchen was quiet, the sounds of clinking pots and the distant hum of voices muffled by the walls. Sophia placed the clipboard on the counter and leaned against it, studying Jake with her sharp, assessing gaze. I want to thank you for yesterday, she said. You kept a clear head. Not everyone can do that. Jake shrugged, avoiding her eyes. It wasn't a big deal. Sophia tilted her head, unconvinced. It was to Natalie, and to Liam. It was to me, too. I know you didn't want to, but you stepped in when it mattered. She paused, letting the words settle. So, tell me the truth. You were a doctor, weren't you? Jake's jaw tightened, his shoulders stiff. For a long moment, he didn't answer, the silence thick in the small room. Finally, he let out a breath, his voice low. I was. Sophia nodded, as though she had already known. What happened? Jake looked up sharply, his eyes flashing with something unreadable. Why do you care? Because I've seen people like you before, Sophia said simply. People who've been chewed up and spit out by life. But that doesn't mean they're broken forever. Jake stared at her, the words stinging more than he wanted to admit. Finally, he leaned against the counter, his hands braced against the edge. It doesn't matter, he said quietly. It's in the past. Sometimes the past has a way of following us, Sophia replied gently. The only way to move forward is to face it. Jake didn't respond. He stared down at the counter, his expression hard. Sophia watched him for a moment before speaking again. I'm not pushing you, she said, her tone softening. But you helped someone yesterday, and whether you admit it or not, it made a difference. You could make a difference here, too. Jake glanced at her, a flicker of something doubt, hope crossing his face. I don't belong here, he said quietly. Belonging isn't about where you came from, Sophia said. It's about what you do now. She picked up the clipboard and turned to leave, pausing at the door. Think about it, Jake. There's more to you than you're letting yourself believe. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet moments. Jake avoided lingering conversations, keeping himself busy with small tasks, fixing a broken chair, sweeping the dining area, helping Mark organize supplies in the storage room. But no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, Sophia's words echoed in his mind. Belonging isn't about where you came from. It's about what you do now. That night, after dinner, Jake found himself sitting on a bench in the shelter's small backyard. The air was cold but quiet, the stars peeking through the dark sky. He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them, but his mind was far away. Can't sleep again? Jake turned to see Natalie approaching, Liam bundled in a blanket against her chest. She sat beside him, her movements slow and careful. "You've been working all day," she said, glancing at him. "You didn't have to." "I had to do something," Jake replied, shrugging. Natalie was quiet for a moment, her gaze soft. "You know, when I first got to the shelter, I felt like I didn't belong either," she said finally. "I was broken, scared, but Sophia told me something that stuck with me." Jake looked at her, waiting. "She said that no one gets through life alone, that sometimes, when you're at your lowest, you just need someone to remind you that you still matter." Jake stared at her, her words cutting through the silence. "You matter, Jake," Natalie said softly. "You saved Liam. You could save more people if you let yourself." Jake looked away, his jaw tight. He didn't know how to respond. Natalie stood carefully, holding Liam close. "Think about it," she said quietly, before walking back toward the shelter, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts. For a long time, he sat there, staring at the stars. The cold bit at him, but he barely felt it. He thought about Sophia's words, about Natalie's quiet persistence, and about the tiny life he had saved with hands he thought were no longer useful. For the first time in years, a question stirred in his mind, one he was too afraid to answer. What if they're right? What if I still matter? The following morning brought a gray sky that pressed heavily on the city, as though winter itself shared the weight of Jake's thoughts. Inside the shelter, life moved on as usual. Voices echoed softly through the halls, dishes clinked in the dining room, and the smell of oatmeal and instant coffee hung in the air. Jake stood by the window in the far corner of the dining area, staring out at the frost-covered ground. He watched the breath of passing strangers form faint clouds in the cold air. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed before fading into silence. It was a world he had grown used to watching, but never being part of a world that had carried on without him. Behind him, the soft sound of footsteps made him turn. Natalie approached, Liam cradled in her arms as he slept peacefully. She paused a few feet away, her expression gentle. "You didn't eat again this morning," she said quietly. Jake shrugged, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Not hungry." Natalie tilted her head slightly, searching his face. "You know, working yourself to the bone doesn't fix anything." "I'm not trying to fix anything," Jake replied, his tone sharper than he intended. He turned back to the window, but Natalie didn't leave. "You can't run from yourself forever," she said softly. "I know what that feels like." Her words hung in the air between them, heavier than the silence that followed. Jake sighed, his shoulders slumping as though the weight he carried was starting to pull him down. "Why do you care so much?" he asked finally, turning to look at her. Natalie took a careful breath, adjusting Liam in her arms. "Because I see what you're trying to hide. You think you're broken, but you're not. You saved my son, Jake. You were calm, steady, like it was instinct. That's not the mark of someone who's lost." She paused, her voice steady but kind. "It's the mark of someone who can still make a difference." Jake looked away, his jaw tight. "I don't deserve that," he muttered. "Not after what I've done." Natalie frowned, stepping closer. "What did you do that was so terrible?" Jake flinched as though the question struck something raw inside him. He turned his back to her, his voice low. "You don't want to know." "But I do," Natalie pressed gently. "You don't have to carry this alone, Jake. Let someone else share the weight, just for once." For a long moment, Jake said nothing. The world outside the window seemed frozen, unmoving. Finally, he shook his head. "It doesn't matter," he said softly. "It won't change anything." Natalie opened her mouth to respond, but a voice from the hallway interrupted them. "Jake," Sophia called, stepping into the room with her usual no-nonsense expression. "I need you for something." Grateful for the distraction, Jake turned and nodded. "Coming." Sophia led Jake to the small medical supply room near the back of the shelter. The space was barely bigger than a closet, filled with boxes of bandages, bottles of antiseptic, and a handful of donated first aid kits stacked haphazardly on shelves. In the center of the room, an elderly man sat on a folding chair, cradling his wrist. "This is Mr. Weaver," Sophia explained. "He took a bad fall outside this morning. Nothing looks broken, but his wrist's swollen, and I don't want to take any chances." Mr. Weaver glanced up at Jake, his wrinkled face creased further with worry. "Hurts like the dickens," he grumbled. Sophia turned to Jake. "Can you help?" Jake froze, staring at the man. The faint smell of rubbing alcohol and bandages in the cramped room felt too familiar, too close to a past he wanted to forget. He opened his mouth to refuse, but Sophia's gaze pinned him in place. "You know what you're doing," she said quietly. "I trust you." Jake's throat tightened. He glanced at Mr. Weaver, who was watching him expectantly, and he felt the invisible wall inside him begin to crack. With a slow nod, he knelt beside the man, his hands moving instinctively. "Let me see it," Jake said, his voice calm. Mr. Weaver extended his arm, wincing slightly. Jake studied the injury, pressing gently around the swollen joint. His movements were careful, precise muscle memory that had been dormant for years, but still remained. "Sprain," Jake muttered after a moment, looking up at Sophia. "It's not broken, but he'll need to keep it immobilized for a while. Do you have any elastic bandages?" Sophia handed him a roll from one of the shelves. Jake took it and began wrapping Mr. Weaver's wrist with practiced ease. The room was silent except for the soft sound of the bandage unraveling. When he finished, he looked up at the elderly man. "Keep it elevated when you can," Jake said, his tone steady, "and try not to use it for a few days. It'll heal faster." Mr. Weaver flexed his fingers slightly, a faint smile pulling at his lips. "You're good at this," he said. "Were you a doctor or something?" Jake stiffened, but before he could respond, Sophia spoke up. "He was," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. Jake glanced at her sharply, but she held his gaze without flinching. Mr. Weaver looked at him with new interest, his smile widening. "Well, lucky for me," the old man said. "You've got the touch, son. I feel better already." Jake muttered something under his breath and stood up quickly, as though afraid to linger in the moment. "Let me know if it gets worse," he said, before turning and walking out of the room. Sophia watched him go, a thoughtful expression on her face. Jake found himself in the backyard again that afternoon, pacing back and forth in the cold. The sky hung low with thick gray clouds, and the faint smell of smoke from a nearby chimney drifted through the air. He couldn't shake the memory of Mr. Weaver's wrist in his hands, the bandages wrapping tightly, like so many wounds he had tended in his former life. "You were a doctor, weren't you?" Mr. Weaver's words replayed in his mind, overlapping with Sophia's. "You could make a difference here." Jake ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow, shaky breath. "It's not that simple," he muttered to himself. "You always talk to yourself, or is today special?" Jake spun around to find Mark, the ex-soldier and unofficial security chief of the shelter, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Mark had a sharp, observant gaze that seemed to miss nothing. "Not in the mood, Mark," Jake muttered, turning away. "You never are," Mark replied, his voice calm but firm. "Saw what you did for Weaver earlier. Nice work." Jake stiffened. "It's nothing." Mark snorted softly. "That's the second time in 2 days you've saved someone in this place. Maybe it's not nothing." Jake didn't respond, staring down at the frozen ground. Mark pushed off the wall and stepped closer, his tone quieter now. "I don't know what you're running from, but you're not fooling anyone. You're good at this, Turner. Whatever happened, whatever you think you lost, you still have it. You just don't want to admit it." Jake clenched his fists, his voice low. "You don't understand." "Maybe I don't," Mark said, shrugging. "But I know a man who's still fighting when I see one. You're here for a reason. Figure out what that reason is before you run away again." With that, Mark walked back inside, leaving Jake alone in the cold. That night, as the shelter settled into silence, Jake sat alone on his cot, staring at his hands again. He thought about Natalie's words, Sophia's quiet trust, and Mark's blunt honesty. For the first time in years, the cracks in his walls felt wide enough to let something through. "You still have it." Jake leaned back against the cold wall, his eyes drifting closed. He was not ready to face the full weight of his past, but a part of him, small and hesitant, began to wonder. What if they were right? What if he still had something left to give? The morning was cold and still, the kind of quiet that made the shelter feel both peaceful and heavy. Jake woke early, the way he always did. Sleep had been shallow, haunted by old memories and the echoes of voices he hadn't heard in years. But this morning was different. Something lingered from yesterday, a persistent thought that would not leave him alone. "You still have it." He sat up slowly, his breath visible in the chilly air. Around him, the room was quiet, the other men still curled under their blankets. He rubbed his hands together, staring at the cracks in the wall, as though the answers might be hidden there. Figure out what that reason is before you run away again. Jake exhaled heavily, raking his hand through his hair. He didn't know what was driving him now, but one thing was clear: he couldn't keep hiding. The dining area was already buzzing by the time Jake stepped in, his boots thudding softly on the worn tile floor. Clara, cheerful despite the early hour, poured coffee for a few of the older residents, while Sophia moved briskly, carrying a clipboard tucked under her arm. Natalie sat in her usual spot near the window, holding Liam, who was babbling softly. She looked up and caught Jake's eye, a small smile spreading across her face. "Good morning." Jake gave her a faint nod in return, shifting awkwardly before grabbing a cup of coffee and finding an empty chair at the far side of the room. He sipped it slowly, letting the warmth cut through the lingering chill. Sophia approached not long after, her expression businesslike, but her voice kind. "We're getting a medical shipment today, some donated supplies. We could use your help sorting through it." Jake hesitated, his gaze flicking up to her face. "Why me?" Sophia shrugged. "Because you know what you're doing, and because you're here." Her words were simple, but they left no room for argument. Jake stared at her for a moment before nodding reluctantly. "Fine." "Good," Sophia said with a small smile. "Come to the storage room after breakfast." Jake found himself in the back corner of the shelter an hour later. The storage room was cluttered, but orderly shelves lined with cans of food, stacks of blankets, and boxes of supplies. Sophia stood beside a table, opening cardboard boxes that had just been dropped off. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic. "Here we go," Sophia said, pulling out a box of medical gloves and setting it aside. "Some of this is for first aid, but a lot of it needs sorting. Can you tell me what's still good?" Jake stared at the open boxes: gauze, alcohol wipes, basic medications, rolls of bandages. His hands hovered over the supplies, his fingers twitching as though they remembered their old purpose. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, I can do that." Sophia stepped back, giving him space. "Take your time. Let me know if you need anything." For a long moment, Jake simply stood there, staring down at the supplies. The memories came unbidden: bright white operating rooms, the sterile smell of hospitals, the calm focus of his hands as they worked to save lives. The man he had been felt so distant now, as though he belonged to someone else entirely. He picked up a roll of bandages and unwrapped it carefully, testing its elasticity. It was good. The gauze, clean and unopened, would be useful. Slowly, methodically, Jake began sorting the supplies, his movements steady and precise. With each box he opened, he felt something familiar settle in his chest, not quite comfort, but close. The rhythm of the work was calming, like slipping into a role that he hadn't realized he missed. By the time Natalie entered the storage room later that afternoon, Jake had cleared most of the table, neatly organizing piles of supplies into labeled categories. He didn't notice her at first, his focus trained on a half-empty box of antiseptic wipes. "You've been busy," Natalie said softly, causing Jake to look up with a start. "Yeah," he muttered, clearing his throat. "Just helping out." Natalie stepped closer, Liam still nestled against her chest. She studied the table and the way Jake had arranged everything: clean, efficient, deliberate. "You're good at this," she said. "It's nothing," Jake replied quickly, brushing off the compliment. Natalie shook her head. "No, it's not nothing. You care about this. You're careful. I can see it." Jake turned his attention back to the supplies, uncomfortable under her gaze. "I used to do this kind of thing every day," he admitted, his voice low. Before what?" Natalie asked gently. Jake stiffened. For a moment, he considered shutting her out, throwing up the walls he had built so carefully. But something about Natalie, the way she listened without judgment, the way she didn't push too hard, made it impossible to turn away. He let out a shaky breath. "Before I lost everything." Natalie waited, giving him the space to speak. Jake hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up a box of bandages and set it down again. "I was a doctor," he said finally, the words heavy in the quiet room. "I was good at it too, but one day, one mistake cost a man his life. It wasn't all my fault, but I was the one they blamed. I lost my license, my career, everything." He paused, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I tried to fight it at first, but it didn't matter. I had no money, no connections. The people I trusted turned their backs on me." He swallowed hard. "Eventually, I just stopped trying." The silence stretched, broken only by the faint sound of Liam's soft breathing. Natalie's heart ached as she listened, the weight of Jake's pain hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been unbearable." Jake let out a bitter laugh. "It was, but I got used to it. At least I thought I did." Natalie stepped closer, her voice steady. "It wasn't your fault, Jake. Whatever happened, you did your best." Jake looked up sharply. "You don't know that." "I know you saved Liam," Natalie replied without hesitation. "I know that you didn't give up on him when he needed you. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are." Jake stared at her, his chest tightening. The walls he had built so carefully were cracking, and it terrified him. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Natalie shook her head. "Maybe not. But I do know one thing. You can't let one moment define the rest of your life. You still have the ability to help people, Jake. You still have something to give." Jake turned away, his jaw tight as he tried to process her words. "I'm not asking you to change overnight," Natalie said softly. "But don't let what happened take away who you are. The world needs people like you, even if you don't believe it yet." For a moment, Jake couldn't speak. He stood there, his hands trembling faintly at his sides. Finally, he whispered, "I don't know if I can." Natalie smiled faintly, her voice warm and steady. "Then let us help you figure it out." That night, as the shelter grew quiet and the residents settled into their beds, Jake sat alone in the storage room. He stared at the neatly organized supplies, his fingers tracing the edge of a box of gauze. Natalie's words echoed in his mind. "You still have something to give." The truth of it scared him. For so long, he had told himself that he was nothing, that his past was a chain that could not be broken. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something different, small and fragile, but real. Hope. Jake leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the ceiling. He wasn't sure what came next, but maybe, just maybe, he was ready to find out. Jake sat on the edge of his cot, the faint hum of voices from the dining room drifting through the thin walls of the shelter. Sleep had evaded him again, But this time it was not the usual restless torment that kept him awake. It was something else, a pull he hadn't felt in years, one that left him uneasy, yet curious. "You still have something to give." Natalie's words echoed in his mind, persistent as a heartbeat. He let out a slow breath, rubbing his hands together as he stared at the cracks in the floor. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't entirely sure what to do with himself. He had spent years convinced that his hands were worthless, that the man he used to be was gone for good. But the past few days helping Liam, tending to Mr. Weaver, sorting through supplies had chipped away at that certainty. His instincts were still there, buried under layers of regret and self-doubt. And whether he liked it or not, people were starting to notice. By mid-morning, Jake found himself back in the storage room. The space had become a strange sort of refuge for him, quiet, orderly, and tucked away from the rest of the shelter's chaos. He stood at the table, organizing bottles of antiseptic and rolls of bandages, the rhythm of his work calming his nerves. "Back here again?" Jake turned at the sound of Sophia's voice. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "Thought I'd make myself useful," Jake muttered, returning to the supplies. "You've been doing a lot of that lately," Sophia replied, stepping into the room. "We appreciate it, you know. I know it's not easy for you." Jake didn't look up, his fingers tightening around a box of gauze. "I'm just keeping busy." Sophia nodded, her tone softening. "Maybe, but it's more than that, isn't it?" Jake glanced at her, a flicker of unease in his expression. "What are you getting at?" Sophia studied him carefully, her gaze steady. "You're not as lost as you think you are, Jake. I see it when you're working. You still have that steady hand, that instinct to help. It's not something you can just bury forever." Jake stiffened. "It's not that simple." Sophia sighed, leaning against the edge of the table. "It rarely is. But I know what happens when people like you shut themselves off from the world. You stop believing you have anything left to give. I've seen it before." Jake swallowed hard, turning his attention back to the supplies. "Why does it matter to you?" "Because I run this place," Sophia said calmly. "And I know that everyone who walks through these doors has something valuable to offer, whether they believe it or not." She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "Natalie trusts you. That says something. And I trust you too. But more than that, I think you're starting to trust yourself again, even if you're too stubborn to admit it." Jake's throat tightened. He didn't respond, afraid that if he opened his mouth, the words he had been holding back would spill out. Sophia pushed away from the table, her voice quiet but firm. "You can keep running if you want to, Jake, but maybe it's time to stop and see where you are." With that, she turned and left, leaving Jake alone in the storage room. He stared after her, the silence pressing heavy on his chest. The day moved slowly, but something about it felt different. Jake found himself drawn into the quiet routines of the shelter in ways he hadn't allowed before. He helped Mark repair a broken chair, carried supplies for Clara as she set up activities for the children, and even sat quietly with Natalie at lunch, listening as she spoke softly to Liam. It felt strange, this small sense of belonging, but it wasn't altogether unwelcome. Late in the afternoon, Sophia appeared again, her face flushed from the cold. "We have a situation," she said, her tone brisk. "A man just came in. He's in bad shape. He fell outside and hit his head." Jake froze, his pulse quickening. "What do you need me to do?" Sophia met his eyes, her expression steady. "Help him." Jake hesitated, the old panic flaring in his chest. He wanted to say no, to retreat back into the safety of his walls, but Sophia's words from earlier echoed in his mind. "You're not as lost as you think you are." "Where is he?" Jake asked, his voice low. Sophia's expression softened slightly, as though she knew how much effort it had taken him to say those words. "In the office. Natalie's with him." Jake followed Sophia down the hall, his steps quick but heavy. When they entered the office, he saw a man slumped in a chair, holding a bloodied cloth to the side of his head. He looked disoriented, his skin pale. Natalie knelt beside him, speaking softly, her face lined with worry. Jake's instincts took over. He moved toward the man, his voice calm but firm. "Let me see." Natalie looked up as Jake knelt beside her, relief flashing across her face. "He tripped on the sidewalk," she explained quickly. "There's a lot of blood." Jake carefully pulled the cloth away, inspecting the gash on the man's temple. It wasn't deep, but the bleeding was steady, and the man's sluggish movements worried him. "What's your name?" Jake asked, keeping his tone gentle. "Ron," the man mumbled. "Ron, I need you to stay awake for me, okay?" Jake said, grabbing a clean cloth from Sophia, who had retrieved a small first aid kit. He applied gentle pressure to the wound, speaking calmly as he worked. "You're going to be all right. It looks worse than it is." Ron winced, but nodded faintly. Natalie hovered nearby, her eyes wide with concern. "Is he going to be okay?" Jake glanced at her. "He will be, but he'll need to rest for a while." He worked quickly, cleaning the wound and securing a makeshift bandage to stop the bleeding. His hands were steady, his movements sure. For the first time in years, the familiar rhythm of saving someone brought a strange sense of peace. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at Ron, whose breathing had evened out. "You'll be fine," Jake said softly. "Take it easy, and let Sophia or Natalie know if you feel dizzy or nauseous." Ron nodded, his eyes fluttering closed as he leaned back against the chair. Natalie smiled at Jake, her voice soft with gratitude. "You did it again." Jake stood quickly, brushing off her words as though they stung. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing," Natalie replied firmly. "It matters." Jake turned away, his chest tightening. He could feel her eyes on him as he left the office, but he couldn't face her, not yet. That night, as the shelter grew quiet, Jake sat alone in the backyard, the cold air biting at his skin. His mind replayed the events of the day, the way his hands had moved without hesitation, the calm that had settled over him as he worked. He hadn't felt that in years, not since the day his life had fallen apart. For so long, he had told himself that he couldn't go back, that the man he had been was gone forever. But today had proven him wrong. That man, the doctor, was still there, waiting. He ran a hand over his face, the weight of that realization pressing against him. He didn't know what came next, but as he stared up at the sky, he felt something shift inside him, a quiet voice that whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to start again. The walls he had built around himself weren't gone, but for the first time, he could see the cracks. And through them, light was starting to shine. The late winter sun hung low in the sky, barely cutting through the chill that settled over the city. Inside the shelter, life carried on as usual. Children's laughter echoed faintly from Clara's classroom, while Sophia's steady voice rang through the halls as she organized supplies. It was an ordinary day for most, but not for Jake. He sat on the edge of a wooden bench in the backyard, staring at his hands. The same hands that had once saved lives, hands that had steadied a scalpel, bandaged wounds, and brought calm to chaos. For years he had thought those hands were worthless, a cruel reminder of everything he'd lost. But yesterday had changed something. Helping Ron had been instinctive, automatic, and afterward, when Natalie had looked at him, her gratitude so genuine it made his chest ache, he'd felt pride, a small ember, but real. "You're doing it again," came a voice, pulling him from his thoughts. Jake looked up to see Natalie standing a few feet away, Liam snug against her chest in his carrier. She smiled faintly, a knowing look in her eyes. "Doing what?" Jake muttered. "Staring at your hands like they've wronged you somehow," she replied softly, walking over to sit beside him. "What are you thinking about?" Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yesterday. Ron? Natalie asked. Jake nodded, staring ahead. I didn't expect it to feel natural. Like a part of me I thought was dead just woke up. Maybe it's because it never really was dead, Natalie said gently. It was just waiting for the right time. Jake exhaled, his breath fogging in the cold air. He didn't know how to explain it, but she wasn't wrong. It scared him, the way something he had buried so deeply was beginning to resurface. You saved someone again, Jake, Natalie continued, her voice soft but firm. That matters. You matter. Jake shook his head. You keep saying that, but you don't know the whole story. Then tell me, Natalie urged. I'm here. I'll listen. Jake hesitated, his walls trembling under the weight of her words. The instinct to shut her out was strong habitual, but for some reason he didn't want to push her away. He glanced at her, then at Liam, who slept peacefully in her arms. The baby's tiny hand poked out from the folds of the blanket, soft and perfect. Jake's chest tightened. He remembered when he had once believed his work could change lives, save people when he thought he mattered. But the moment that had taken it all away still haunted him. Years ago, I was a surgeon, Jake said finally, his voice low, the words like gravel in his throat. General surgery, I loved it. I thought I was good at it too. Natalie turned to face him, giving him her full attention. She didn't interrupt, didn't push. She just listened. There was a man, Jake continued, his gaze fixed on the ground. A patient with an abdominal complication. It should have been a routine surgery, one I'd done before, 100 times. He paused, the memory sharp and clear. But something went wrong. An unexpected hemorrhage. We were losing him, and I did everything I could, everything I knew to do. But it wasn't enough. He died on the table. Jake's voice faltered, the weight of the memory pressing against his chest. I knew it wasn't just my fault. There was another doctor there, Dr. Smith, my supervisor. He had insisted on taking control at the wrong moment. But when everything fell apart, he stepped back and let me take the blame. Natalie's brows furrowed, her eyes soft with understanding. He blamed you? Jake nodded, bitterness lacing his voice. He didn't have to say it outright. The rumors started first. Whispers in the hospital hallways, stares from the staff, and then the investigation came. Smith had connections, people who could sweep his role under the rug. I didn't. Natalie's heart ached as she listened, imagining the loneliness of that moment. What happened then? I lost everything, Jake said quietly. My medical license, my career, my friends disappeared, afraid to take my side. I couldn't find work, not as a doctor, not even as anything else. Eventually, I couldn't afford my apartment. The savings dried up, and here I am. He let out a hollow laugh, his hands clenching into fists. I thought I could outrun it. I thought if I kept my head down, no one would ever expect anything from me again. But you, Sophia, this place... He shook his head. You're all making me question that. Natalie's voice was steady when she spoke. Because you're worth more than the life you've been surviving, Jake. He turned to look at her, his expression wary. You don't know that. I do, Natalie replied softly. You're not the only one who's felt like they've been buried alive by life. I know what it's like to feel like nothing you do matters. But here's the thing. You helped me. You helped Liam. You helped Ron. That's not the mark of a man who's broken. That's the mark of a man who's still fighting, even if he doesn't see it yet. Jake stared at her, the words hitting him harder than he cared to admit. What if I'm not ready? Then take one step at a time, Natalie said. You don't have to fix everything all at once. Just don't give up. She reached out and placed her hand gently over his. You've been carrying this alone for too long, Jake. Let someone help. For the first time in years, Jake didn't pull away. That evening, Sophia called everyone together for a meeting in the dining area. The residents gathered around, sitting at the mismatched tables, as Sophia stood at the front with her usual calm authority. "I wanted to thank everyone for their hard work these past few weeks," she began, glancing around the room. "We've made a lot of progress, but we're not done yet. The shelter still needs support, and so do the people in it. Each of you has something valuable to give, whether it's time, skills, or just a kind word to someone who needs it." Sophia's gaze settled on Jake, lingering for just a moment before moving on. "We have a doctor visiting tomorrow, someone who's offered to volunteer here once a week. They'll help us set up a more organized medical station, and we'll need someone to assist them. It's a great opportunity to build something important here." The room buzzed softly with quiet murmurs, but Jake remained still. He could feel Sophia's words directed at him, even if she hadn't said his name. His pulse quickened, the old fear clawing its way back up. Natalie, sitting at a table nearby, gave him a small, encouraging smile. One step at a time, her voice echoed in his mind. Later, as the meeting ended and people dispersed, Sophia approached Jake where he stood near the back of the room. "You heard what I said about the medical station," she began carefully. "I think you could help us with it." Jake hesitated, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "I don't know if I can." Sophia studied him for a moment, her voice soft. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it." Jake nodded stiffly. "I'll think about it." Sophia smiled faintly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's all I ask." That night, Jake lay awake in his cot, staring at the ceiling. His heart felt heavy, but for the first time, it wasn't from regret or anger. It was from possibility. You helped Liam. You helped Ron. He couldn't erase the past. He couldn't undo the mistakes, the pain. But maybe he could do something now, one step at a time. Morning crept over the city, bringing with it a pale light that filtered through the shelter's windows. Jake Turner sat on the edge of his cot, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He hadn't slept much, but for once, it wasn't because of nightmares or restless thoughts. Instead, it was something quieter, an unsettled feeling of change. The meeting from the night before echoed in his mind. Sophia's words about the visiting doctor, the offer to help with the medical station, and Natalie's quiet encouragement. One step at a time, she had said. For years he had buried the part of himself that had once saved lives. The surgeon, the healer. It was easier to survive when he believed that part of him was dead. But the past weeks had chipped away at that wall, piece by piece. Helping Liam, tending to Ron, and the small, steady moments of usefulness had reminded him of something he thought he had lost forever: purpose. He glanced around the room. The other men were still sleeping, wrapped tightly in their thin blankets. The shelter was quiet, but he knew it wouldn't last. Soon, the day would begin, and the visiting doctor would arrive. He ran his hands through his hair and took a deep breath. His pulse was steady, but his chest ached with the weight of indecision. He didn't know if he was ready, but something inside him whispered that he had to try. The dining area buzzed with movement as residents trickled in for breakfast. Clara had set up an arts and crafts table in the corner for the kids, and the smell of coffee filled the air. Jake sat at a table near the back, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His gaze flickered across the room, landing briefly on Natalie, who was helping Liam drink from a small sippy cup. She caught his eye and smiled, soft and encouraging, the kind of smile that made him feel seen. Before he could look away, Sophia's voice broke through the hum of conversation. "Everyone, can I have your attention?" The room quieted as Sophia stepped to the center, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "This morning, we're welcoming a volunteer doctor to the shelter. Dr. Whitaker has offered to set up a basic medical station for us. It's something we've needed for a long time, and it'll make a huge difference here." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Sophia turned her gaze to Jake, her expression calm but pointed. "I know there are people here with skills and knowledge that can help. If anyone's willing to assist Dr. Whitaker, let me know." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't miss the way Natalie glanced at him, hopeful but patient. Sophia's words hung in the air for a moment before the room returned to its usual hum of activity. Jake stayed where he was, his hands wrapped tightly around his coffee cup. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, like a hand on his shoulder. Dr. Whitaker arrived just after lunch, a tall, wiry man, with graying hair and a warm smile. He wore a simple sweater and carried a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder. Sophia introduced him to a small group of residents as they gathered in the dining area. Jake lingered near the back of the room, watching. Dr. Whitaker shook hands, asked questions, and moved with an ease that reminded Jake painfully of who he used to be. The way the doctor interacted with the residents, calm, kind, without judgment, sent a strange pang through Jake's chest. "This way, Dr. Whitaker," Sophia said, leading him toward the makeshift medical station they had set up in one of the smaller rooms. Jake hesitated for a long moment, his heart pounding in his ears. Then, almost without realizing it, he stood and followed. When he reached the doorway of the small medical room, Dr. Whitaker was already unpacking his bag, laying out basic tools, stethoscopes, blood pressure cuffs, thermometers, and small boxes of first aid supplies. Sophia glanced up and spotted Jake lingering there. "Jake," she said, her voice soft but purposeful, "come in. We could use your help." Dr. Whitaker looked up then, his brow lifting in curiosity. "You must be Jake," he said warmly. "Sophia mentioned you have experience. I'd be glad to have another pair of hands." Jake froze, feeling the familiar instinct to retreat. But then he saw Sophia's steady gaze, and Natalie's words echoed in his mind. One step at a time, he stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'll help," he said quietly. Dr. Whitaker smiled. "Good. Let's get to work." The afternoon passed in a blur of steady activity. Dr. Whitaker checked on residents, taking their blood pressure, listening to their lungs, and asking questions about old injuries or health concerns. Jake worked beside him, helping organize supplies, disinfecting tools, and taking notes as the doctor worked. At first, his hands shook slightly, but as the hours passed, they grew steadier. The rhythm of the work, the calm, the focus was familiar, like slipping into an old pair of shoes. "You know what you're doing," Dr. Whitaker said at one point, glancing at Jake with a knowing look. "Have you done this before?" Jake hesitated. "I used to." Dr. Whitaker nodded, as though that was enough of an answer. "You're good at it." The words caught Jake off guard, and he didn't know how to respond. He had spent years convincing himself that he was useless, that his hands could only fail him. But here now, he was making a difference. When they finished for the day, Dr. Whitaker clapped Jake on the shoulder. "You've got a gift," he said simply. "Not everyone can do this. You should keep going." Jake watched as Dr. Whitaker packed up his things and said goodbye to Sophia before leaving the shelter. The room grew quiet again, but something inside Jake was shifting. That evening, as the shelter settled into its nightly rhythm, Jake sat outside in the backyard. The air was cold, the stars faint above the city skyline. He heard footsteps behind him, and a moment later, Natalie appeared, carrying Liam wrapped snugly in a blanket. "Mind some company?" she asked. Jake shook his head. "Not at all." Natalie sat beside him, resting Liam on her lap as she looked up at the sky. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, filled with the kind of peace Jake wasn't used to. "You did it," Natalie said softly, breaking the quiet. Jake glanced at her. "What?" "You helped today. You stepped up." She smiled faintly, her voice warm. "I knew you could." Jake looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers slowly. "It's been a long time since I felt like I was worth anything." "You are," Natalie replied without hesitation. "I hope you're starting to see that." Jake let out a quiet breath. "Maybe I am." Natalie smiled, turning her attention back to Liam, who had started to doze off. "You know, You're not the only one who's been given a second chance. This place, it gave me one too, and now you're helping give it to others." Jake looked at her, a flicker of something softening his expression. "Maybe that's the point," he said quietly. "We help each other." Natalie nodded, her eyes shining in the faint light. "Exactly." For the first time in years, Jake felt the weight on his chest lift just a little. The past still lingered, but it no longer felt like a chain he couldn't escape. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he could face it. As the shelter lights glowed warmly behind them, Natalie spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't the end for you, Jake. It's just the beginning." Jake looked out at the night sky, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said softly. "Maybe it is." Spring arrived quietly, melting away the last traces of winter. The shelter, once fragile and uncertain, now hummed with life. Flowers bloomed in the small garden Clara had helped the residents plant. Children's laughter filled the courtyard, and people bustled with purpose. In a modest room near the back of the shelter, the small medical station Jake and Dr. Whitaker had worked to build was up and running. Jake stood by a table, organizing donated supplies, while Clara supervised a group of kids drawing posters to brighten the walls. The space was clean, efficient, and most importantly hopeful. A knock on the door broke the rhythm. Jake turned to see Natalie standing in the doorway with Liam perched on her hip, his chubby hands clutching a soft toy. She smiled, and Jake felt the warmth that had grown familiar over the past few weeks. "I thought you might need a break," she said. Jake shrugged, wiping his hands on a clean towel. "I'm good. Things are steady today." Natalie stepped inside, looking around. "It's really starting to come together." Jake nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "Yeah, it is." Liam squirmed in Natalie's arms, reaching out toward Jake with a grin. Jake hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, letting the little boy grab his finger. Liam giggled, and something in Jake's chest softened. Natalie's voice was quiet. "You've changed a lot since that night in the park." Jake met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "So, have you?" Natalie smiled. "We both got second chances, Jake, and you made this happen." Jake shook his head, but there was no bitterness in his voice. "We did it together. This place, it's not just a shelter anymore. It's a home." Natalie nodded, her eyes shining. "For all of us." Outside, the courtyard was alive with residents tending to the garden, fixing old chairs, or simply sitting in the sun. Sophia stood with Mark near the gate, discussing plans for future renovations. The shelter had become more than a refuge. It was a symbol of what people could build when they stood together. Jake stepped out into the sunlight, his coat hanging loosely around his shoulders. He watched as a group of kids raced past, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Natalie joined him, Liam now asleep in her arms. "Look at this place," she said softly. "We did it." Jake took a deep breath, feeling something he hadn't in years. Peace. "Yeah, we did." Sophia spotted them and waved, a proud smile on her face. "The clinic's getting more attention," she called as she approached. "A couple of doctors from Dr. Whitaker's network are volunteering next month. Looks like you're starting something bigger than you realize, Jake." Jake glanced at Natalie, who grinned. "See? Told you you're making a difference." Jake smiled faintly, the truth of it settling in. "It's a start." That evening, after the shelter had grown quiet and the lights were dimmed, Jake sat on the old wooden bench in the backyard. The air was warm, the stars clear above the city skyline. He could hear the faint hum of life inside, voices murmuring, a child laughing, the quiet buzz of a place where people felt safe. Natalie joined him not long after, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She sat beside him in silence for a while, gazing at the night sky. "Do you think you'll ever go back?" she asked suddenly. "To being a doctor, I mean, officially?" Jake considered her words carefully before answering. Maybe one day, he said, his voice steady. But for now, this is enough. Natalie smiled. It's more than enough, Jake. You're helping people. You're giving them hope. Jake looked at her, then back at the shelter. The place that had given him hope when he thought it was gone. Yeah, he said softly. We all are. As the stars stretched endlessly above them, Jake let the silence settle over him. It wasn't the end of his journey, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. The shelter, the people, Natalie and Liam, they were his family now, and he was ready to face whatever the future held. Thank you for joining us on this journey of resilience, hope, and second chances. This story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, kindness can light the way. If you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. Together, we can spread stories of hope, because sometimes one small act of kindness is all it takes to change a life. See you in the next chapter of our journey.